Welcome to Unit 2, and you can see we're using the second unit of our GitHub. GitHub is separated by units. In reality, this gets updated. I mean, you could be watching this video 6 months from now, and it could be slightly different. But the GitHub, we're going to try to keep the GitHub as simple as possible, but we're going to try to update it as much as possible too. So if we did something well the first time and there's a way to do it super well the second time, we're going to game for super well. So there's a couple of improvements upon last week. You'll see that we've eliminated the second version of this website. Now we only have one version, and that's located within the Bootstrap distribution. And so you guys were coding this last week, the Unit 1. And there's a lot of div tags here. And I want to work up to the explanation of these div tags towards the latter half of this unit. There's the third video in Unit 1 in our YouTube playlist will go over all of these tags. And I think it's a half an hour. Look it over, and it will illuminate everything you're doing right there. And so now that we're in Unit 2, we're going to talk about querying NoSQL databases. And we're going to begin by talking a little bit about what's called Web Services Choreography. And you can see here that you have some things that you're familiar with and some things that you haven't heard of yet. S3 is what we went over last week. It's the storage service that's employed by Amazon. It basically supplies HTTP. HTTP and HTTPS are the core building blocks of the internet that give us web sites. So everything is always HTTP, and HTTP is a giver and a taker. You can make a request of an HTTP service, and it's going to respond with what you asked for, and that's very good. So your phone could be wandering around during the day saying, please give me a weather update. Please give me a weather update. Please give me a web services update. Now, SMTP, or Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, is not in this list, right? We could make SMTP a big part of this class. There's enough, frankly. You guys have enough on your plates. HTTP is the perfect service to talk about at this stage in the game. SMTP is just merely another programmable piece of the internet. It's just a protocol that many applications can utilize. Right now, you guys and girls are masters of HTTP, HTTPS. So the first layer that you've created in your web stack is HTTP, and that's supplied via S3. Now, it's interesting that Amazon Web Services doesn't describe S3 in terms of its value. They just say, hey, put your files on S3. S3 is where your files go. And here I'll just kind of get into my Amazon and you guys can jump into your Amazon too. Oops, not my Amazon, my AWS Amazon. And you guys can jump in here. Now, usually when Amazon talks about S3, they don't talk about it in terms of HTTP. And I think that's because S3 has been around for, it's coming on a decade since the beta. It's about 11-year-old. And what Amazon initially did is they say, hey, put all of your images, if you have a website with images, put those images up on S3, or if you have large repositories of files, put them up on S3. If you're the New York Times and you want to put all of the old microfiche of the New York Times in S3 and you want to process them one by one, go ahead and do that. So all of the initial work use cases for S3 were not websites. Now, S3 is a very major way to host websites. So if you go to NPR, you go to some rather cutting-edge media journalism websites, you'll see a lot of S3 involved. If you go to Netflix, every Netflix movie that you stream comes from S3. That's an important proof of concept for us. If we're saying, hey, if it's good enough for the CIA, it's good enough for us. It's good enough for the military, it's good enough for us. It's good enough for Netflix, we'll give it a shot. If it's good enough for most startups, it's good enough for for us. Let's give it a shot. So S3, however, they should say Amazon HTTP service, because every web developer depends upon their web server. That's their primary vehicle for getting value. Now, let me just say this in all honesty, S3 is only one way to get HTTP service. You could go over to EC2 also, and you could boot up a Linux instance and install Apache onto that, or install Tomcat or LightTDPD or your favorite web server container onto that, and that would run just fine. For the purposes of our class, that's inefficient. It's better for us to deploy what's called a static single page, serverless website on S3 and serve up HTTP in the most efficient, secure way possible. And we'll get more into the justification for S3 as a web server as we go along. But S3 is the core service, and of course it's in the cloud here because it's highly redundant. It's hard to crash, it's hard to DOS it, it's hard to man in the middle it, and it's hard to impersonate it. It's very rock solid. And then of course we're going to put our HTML and JavaScript inside of S3. So the prototype that we're working with right here is we have buckets, and the bucket is really just a qualified, name-resolved web server. So anything that goes to this bucket, let's say this is your index, this index has, you have to bear with me because my screen is very, you notice that that bucket is really a part of the name resolution that makes that file available. You know, FQDNs or fully qualified domain names they're kind of the building block of the internet. The internet is very name-based, and names must resolve to IP addresses. So you realize this entire course you won't even see an IP address. Everything is DNS resolved to this bucket. So the bucket is the equivalent of a site or a web server. Now, frankly, if we were to have an Amazon person in here and I would ask them, and they won't answer this question because they know their P's and Q's. They don't answer technical questions. I'll say, well, how many copies of this page are there inside of Amazon? And how distributed is this bucket inside of Amazon? And they'd say, well, we can't tell you, but let me say that your property inside of Amazon is not in the same place. It's located throughout the Amazon cloud, right? The Amazon Web Services is like an Amazon warehouse, and in that the cloud is not based on disk. It's based upon software that pulls many, many disks and many, many RAM pieces together. So a cloud is seen as a large single computing unit that aggregates all of the storage from all the servers and all the RAM and all the CPU cycle from all the servers in one big glob. So when you guys upload your HTML files, Amazon says, great, we'll put a tag on it that says that that file belongs to that bucket and will resolve to that bucket, but it could be located in any number of hard drives. So, the cloud creates this new brand of resiliency because you don't have competition or concurrency trying to compete for any given disk. Your assets are distributed throughout the Amazon cloud based on whatever data center or node of Amazon you happen to be using. I'm just walking it back a little bit and talking about the cloud as a whole and just giving you a sense of perspective of what you got right now, right? So that's quite good. And inside of your bucket, there's going to be files, and this file is going to be located right there. So that's a piece of the choreography. So the first thing I want to do here before I go into these things, the OAuth is, it's a token-based security. Facebook's API helps us to talk to Facebook and get token-based security from Facebook. Facebook is an identity provider. That's of interest to us. We don't need to code our own identity provider. OAuth is an important protocol. Amazon, we're going to use Amazon because they're going to give us some JavaScript that helps us talk to and get data from Amazon. Dynamo is Amazon's NoSQL database service. So that's a very mainstream way to make databases in the cloud for internet production. We're not talking about for analytics where we have data that's sitting still while a small number of users are querying it. SQL is awesome for data marts, data warehousing, large machine learning ops, data science. SQL is unparalleled, especially if you couple it with another good analytics framework like Python or R. SQL is great. Now, the websites that you guys are using, you guys and gals are using, are not using SQL unless there's some analytic behind the scenes. SQL is wonderful, but as we scale, to multi-million user groups, we're not executing SQL on every call. So we're using databases like DynamoDB, and then IAM is a service inside of Amazon that will respect an authentication from Facebook, and then will connect you to assets within Amazon so long as you have an OAuth token from an identity provider like Facebook. So I'm just going over that quick to give you a sense of the choreography of the different clouds that we're going to knit together this unit. But I want you guys and girls to walk around with a little bit of ego, because tonight you get to come home to your parents and be like, yeah, my professor really pushed us. He made us integrate the Amazon cloud, and you name drop, you're like, the same cloud that Netflix uses, on a good day, and my professor made me knit together the Amazon cloud with Facebook. So I program with multiple pieces of the internet. And let me just say that if you're a working web dev, that's what they all do. Now let me say this, and I usually ask this: does anybody in this class not have a Facebook account? Usually there's one Jack Reacher type who's like, no, I don't have a Facebook account. I got real friends. And usually they like to say things like, no, I like to go out on Friday and skateboard illegally, on the sidewalk. And no, I like to play the bass. I like to drag race. I don't have Facebook. And I'm like, yeah, that's wonderful. You're cool. You are. And let me ask you this. I think if I were to ask many of you, how many friends do you have on Facebook that you actively talk to? Many of you will say, well, I have about 12 people that I communicate with on Facebook. And some of you will even say, yeah, I have 4 or 5 people that I communicate with on Facebook. And they've pared down their friends list so that they don't have 500 friends like they did 10 years ago. Does that make sense? Facebook is this anomaly where suddenly you're in contact with your childhood friends. Suddenly you're communicating with girlfriend from 3rd grade, the girl on the playground whom you now is married, and you're looking at her picture. There's this moment where everybody was connected. I was listening to a wonderful speaker the other day talk about how when he and I were growing up, we're all in our 40s, when the 40-year-old people were growing up, we would talk about 6 degrees of separation, right? Where everybody is separated by 6 different contexts. That number of contexts is now down into the middle 3s or low 4s. So we are more connected than we used to be based upon the Facebook paradigm. But what happened was dystopia set in. The fact that you were connected to that many people made people feel very uneasy, right? That said, well, I got into a fist fight with this person in 6th grade. Why would I want to trust them now? Why would I want to be surveilled by people I used to hide from? Does that make sense? Facebook has its own dystopia. So when people say, no, I don't have Facebook, I find that kind of beautiful, because I'm like, sweet, there is still masculinity in the world. Did you carry a hatchet to class so that you could make a fire and get warm in the quad? Or did you carry a Weber barbecue to class so you could make lunch on the quad? There are still manly men in the world, who are like, I'll make it on my own. I got a backpack. I'm good. But for this class, Facebook, we're going to use Facebook like pro developers, and we're going to rely upon Facebook for its ability to authenticate people. And that'll save us about a month of time, so we won't have to code our own authentication mechanism. Now, an alternative to this would be for us to use the University Active Directory that you all use to log into your email. That uses the same OAuth infrastructure as Facebook. We could also use a Google Plus, that would work, and we could also use your Amazon login as well, right? Amazon is now quite, do any of you not have Amazon? That would be legitimate as well. And maybe for a future iteration, I will punish you by forcing you to code your own IDP, your own identity provider. Does that make sense? But it's another darned if I do, darned if I don't. So Facebook quickly gives us authentication and then helps us shoot for bigger fish. Plus, if you admit to this, and any Jack Reach or tough guy will say, well, you know what? I want to leverage the fact that everybody has a Facebook. Everybody in the Western world has a Facebook, and a few people in the developing world have Facebooks, right? Facebook is this important layer that sits atop the internet. Everybody has it, so a good business person would try to leverage the content accessible via Facebook. If a person has a Facebook, can't I use that to distribute my own property? Can I understand my users better based on date of birth, etc., from their Facebook? And any tough guy out there, and believe me, it's not just the guys. I have a fair share of young women who are also like, nah, no Facebook, dude, forget it. My skater young ladies who are like, no Facebook, man, I'm a cool bass player. And that's great, but any good business person will probably agree that Facebook has in itself some invested value that you can mine, and you should be thinking in those terms, even if you have to get your own Facebook. So we're gonna. Here's an example. You can see this child is now like 6 years older now, so it's been years since I'm so cool. I don't update my Facebook anymore either, so I get it. I'm cool too. So now here's what I want to have you do first. I want you to go to your IDE, whatever you're using right now, and I want you to just think for a moment about what you're going to use to code your web pages. Now, a lot of you are using Notepad++, outstanding. I use Eclipse. Some of you are using NetBeans, wonderful. I would love to see some students experiment with more web-based IDEs where their editor is on the web somewhere, is in the cloud. I'm very keen on that. I'm so lazy. I work hard with the tools that I've used for the better part of 20 years, but I'm very lazy about learning new tools because I don't like to do things, 3 different ways, the same thing 3 different ways. I like to do one thing one way and move on to playing with the children. Does that make sense? Like, I won't get extra points for my 7-year-old if I'm trying out a new editor. Does that make sense? So with you all, college kids love to do everything 7 different ways. So I'm just kidding. But most likely, it's going to be the college kids who say, oh no, this editor is better. Here, try this. Or they're going to reach out and try the new stuff. But let me just say within Eclipse, here's the basic idea. You want to make a new project, and the kind of project that we're going to make in this class is a static web project. And it means that, it means that it's serverless. And the target runtime, we're not going to run a server that accepts HTTP connections. We're going to put my static or my single HTML file up on S3. That's how I'm going to operate. So instead of deploying a server, like on the instance of a web server here inside of my Eclipse, I'm actually going to just take my HTML file and I'm going to upload it to S3. And that, my friends, is the simplest web development you've ever seen. I have worked with teams where they needed to have somebody who is specifically trained to do deployment. And many of the members did not have deployment skills. It takes a lot. It takes time to get deployment skills. Those are good skills. But frankly, we have better things to spend our time on. It is highly, if you want to deploy your own web server, you also must secure that thing. You also must secure the PHP or the JSP that you've installed there. You must remove any, exploit likelihood of any of the web containers that you have here. You must have an intrusion protection team. With Amazon, at least, there are very few, if any, instances of people hacking S3. There's less likelihood of that than, say, if you deploy a PHP or a Ruby on Rails or a JSP or even a node instance. Okay, so that's going to be the name. Context, this is the name of the project, and then web content is going to be the folder where your stuff is going to be. And here's my example throwaway ready to go, and then web content is going to be the folder where my content is going to go. And what I can do is I can say, hey, web content, let's make a new HTML file, and here's what our production example is going to look like. Let's see, where is that example? Our sample warm-up? No. I built one for you guys just a minute ago, and it's called our JavaScript workbook. Or is it, here, I have it on. Feeling dumb, basic JavaScript examples. And here is my basic JavaScript examples. Okay. And so if you all would like to take a moment to experiment with that, that's fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what this looks like. And what I'd really like for you to do in a moment, and I'm going to give you a chance to build this file. I'm going to quit off of the lecture for a minute. I'm going to give you a chance to do this file. But let me explain what's happening here. Now, you've built your project, and it means that your project has a series of enclosing folders. And I can sort of locate. I'm going to show that in my System Explorer. And so you can see that this is a folder, web content is there, and I'm going to get in, that's the file. So I can double click on this and deploy it. This is just running locally, and it's just running, local process. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial up a number, and if this number is between 1 and 10, then I've done it right. If I have my number beyond 10 or less than, it's no longer valid. So let's dial up beyond 10, and the input is no longer valid. And since you all have had some basic programming, you probably have a good understanding of how to program something like this. But let's talk about how it works in JavaScript. Now, firstly, we're going to announce that we're using HTML5. Oh, and by the way, just in case you want to grab a copy of this, this is going to be under Unit 2, Basic JavaScript Examples, Web Content, getElement, and you can grab this here if you like. If you'd like to synchronize with your GitHub, or you can, download this from the web. You can go download that, not as text, but as HTML, and you can have that right away. But let me go through this because it looks really nice in the end. Sorry to say that. Y'all are smart, so I give you options here. Now, just hold up. I'm just going to talk a little bit, then I'm going to let you go and play, okay? This is HTML. It announces to the browser that we're going to code HTML. It says, hey, browser, prepare to interpret or compile HTML. Then here's the HTML part, and the HTML is going to close right here. First, we're going to open the body. The body is the visible part of the website. You can have a body, and you can also have a head. A head is where the sort of pre-compiler directives are going to be, and we'll talk more about the head. Last week, we talked about the head. The head is usually where the CSS is located, and you use the head to tell the browser where some of the additional resources the web page will need in case it needs to download those resources from elsewhere. And they're normally CSS files and JavaScript files. So the head prepares the browser for the body, okay, like Bootstrap. So H1, you can see how that, let's open that up. H1 is going to be the title. And then try inputting a number between 1 and 10. That's happening within a paragraph tag. A paragraph tag just gives you a line where you see some text, and then you get a free line right after it. And that's what the paragraph is going to do. And again, I'm using the inspect element here so I can kind of show off how these different elements show up. So you have the H1, and you have a paragraph. Paragraph are really a big deal because you can put a lot of valuable information inside of a paragraph. In this class, we're going to try to get by using like 5 or 6 HTML tags. we're going to be as ninja as possible, because frankly, if you have a div, a paragraph, a div, a paragraph, an image, and a hyperlink, you can make Amazon.com. Amazon is wonderfully fast and compact, and it relies upon those core elements. So having an encyclopedic knowledge of HTML is marginally more important than having a very fundamental understanding. So we're going to strive for the fundamental understanding, and we're going to branch out. So H1, paragraph. Now the input ID is going to be this little box, and on certain browsers it'll allow you these little numbers to dial it upward and back. Some of them don't. But that's called an input box. And you can see right here that it allows and it creates numeric data. And then its ID is called num. And then what you do inside of HTML is you open up the tag with input, and then you close the tag, and the browser puts this in for us. Then you close the input tag. And so you start compilation of that element, then you stop compilation of this element. You start compilation of HTML, then you end compilation of HTML. And that's the close and start. And I'm just kind of putting this in your brain right here. Now this is the button. The button is of type button, and you can see the submit content is in there. And then what happens on click is an event that's associated with every button. So every button has an on click. And we're going to say, hey, when you click that button, it's going to throw my function. And my function is going to be right here. So it's going to throw my function. And my function is going to be inside of the script part. Now, let me say this, and you guys will get it immediately. This right here is HTML. This right here is JavaScript. JavaScript is like software that runs inside of HTML. JavaScript is source code that downloads with your HTML. And so when you think about the security part and the data part and the getting of data from the rest of the internet, that's going to be JavaScript's job. And the HTML is more about look and feel. So as you go to work in startups or in big corporations, you realize that there are certain people that really focus on the look and feel. And then there are other people who really focus on the data security and the getting of information. And we're going to focus more, we're going to train people more to be JavaScript people, more in information security, more of the data people. And there's going to be other programs that will emphasize the look and feel. We're less about look and feel. But you can see that my function gets triggered right here. And then we have a bracket that will open up that function inside the script. We'll set up two variables. One is x, and x is whatever people type into or whatever shows up inside of this box. And the reason why we can get data from the page, from the user, is because we're going to say, hey, go inside the HTML document and get the content that's inside of this ID. Inside of this ID, that's the ID of that element. Element is an HTML element or an HTML input or a box. Get whatever's inside of num, which is num is that input, and then get its value, and then assign that to x. My friends, if you can get this line, you will have received the core lesson of this week, which is that JavaScript needs getElementById to really be of value. And what getElementById does is it controls what happens on the web page, because it can always grab stuff by its identifier and change its value or get its value. And so it's a lot like get and set when you take Java. When you get, you can take information and you can assign it to something. When you set data, you can get data you already have and change it somewhere. So get and set are both done by getElementById. So x is initialized based on whatever's inside of here. Now, I'm going to say that many, many different times in many, many different ways. But let me just say that what makes JavaScript work is getElementById. Yes, sir?
So what's the difference between ID and class?
Okay. The student, just in case YouTube, you didn't hear that excellent question, the student asked, What is the difference between ID and class? And let me say that you can see in this example how we don't have class here. And you can also see that we don't have any head and we're not linking to any CSS. Class is always going to be a CSS thing. A class refers to something that's defined within a CSS file. And so class has everything to do with how you want things to look. Make this HTML entity assume the properties of that particular CSS class. So you're right, we could put in class is equal to something right here. But that would only because we would have a CSS somewhere in there. But right now we do not. Therefore, we don't have any classes available to us. That's why I like this example, is it's nice and simple. And what we do have here is the IDs. So, and this is good quiz material, ID makes an HTML entity visible by JavaScript. So what JavaScript does is it parses the tree of HTML elements within any given HTML page, and it says, hey, look for the entity called num, and I could change that. Maybe I call it number n, and then I need to update that. I say, hey, look for number n within the page and grab its value. And so when you think about it, the value of ID is that you can make JavaScript talk to your HTML and talk back and forth. Therefore, if we call this class interactive web development, really what we're talking about is making your HTML talk to your JavaScript and back and forth. And so as you load web pages, and this is a good example, as you load and use web pages, the page can talk back to you as you move along. You know, the page can make a dialogue with you as you do things in a very simple way. And so that's what's of particular interest to us. Now, imagine working with Gmail, probably one of the world's first and foremost web applications. You realize that you can sit in front of your Gmail all day and just watch the messages pour in. I mean, before there was ever Facebook and before there was ever Twitter, there was Gmail. And what I would do as a project manager, I would just sit in front of Gmail and just watch for the messages pouring in. I would just quickly tap responses to people. And that was a happy way to quickly see content pour in real time. But I digress. And you see, this is a comment. This comment will not show up. It will pass over the internet, but it will not show up. But if I said, well, look, if x is not a number, or x is less than 1, or x is greater than 10, go ahead and set this other value of text to input not valid or input OK. And then at the end, depending upon what text is, grab demo and then set the content of it to text. Inner HTML is just the HTML that shows up. And so when I scope that, that's my demo paragraph, and that's where the output is going to show up. So it's a really good example of putting some software inside of a web page that responds to what the user is doing. And that's the discipline of web dev in a nutshell, in a very small nutshell. But what I'm going to do, yes, I'm going to take a question, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you fool around with this for a few minutes.
So you don't need to define the data type like string or...
Again, wonderful question. YouTube, the student asked, do you need to define the data type of stuff? The answer is no. JavaScript is an interpreted language. It's not a compiled language. So it doesn't have the software engineering depth of a Java where it actually works with the blocks within the operating system. In fact, it has to quickly just send bytecode and Unicode over the internet, and it's interpreted on the fly. So really, JavaScript is guessing whether you want to treat that 9 as text or as a number. And so, in fact, there is skills within JavaScript development where we have to say to JavaScript, hey, that 9 is a number. Treat that 9 as a number rather than as a string or as non-arithmetic content. Now, one way we do that is we define the number as a number so that it's encoded as such within the JavaScript kernel, the JavaScript kernel inside your browser. So, and other ways is that we put a .0, like we go something like this. We say, instead of it, we say something like that, and that tips JavaScript that this is going to be a number with floating points. We'll get more into that as we go. So, yeah. Now, what I quickly wanted to talk about is the HTML that we were doing last week. I wanted to quickly just go back to that and say the CSS is the reason why we get classes inside of our HTML. So that if you have the CSS, you have the classes available to you. So you can make a lot of different classes within your CSS that becomes accessible to your HTML. So I really want to put forth the idea that HTML and CSS are joined at the hip. Don't do one without the other. It's like riding a motorbike with a helmet, right? All works well. HTML works well with CSS. And when you're using Bootstrap, since there are hundreds of classes within the Bootstrap file, you guys just go ahead and grab your Bootstrap and just begin to experiment with the different classes that are available to you. And one way to analyze and learn CSS is to just use the class and then watch the properties load right here. But you can see already that these are different classes that are made accessible. Now this is hard. You guys are smart, and so I've just given you something that's very motivating. But you can see you need to begin with a Nav Bar Wrapper, and that creates a big block up at the top. Then you create a container. Then you create a nav bar inside of it, then another container for the nav bar header, and then a collapsible. And you just sort of appropriate that, and then you have the links accessible here as you go along. The LI stands for list item. UL stands for unordered list. In traditional old school, HTML3 and 4, UL look like bullets, like in Microsoft Word. In HTML5, especially Bootstrap, UL no longer looks like a bullet. It actually looks like this. So LI and UL are very important building blocks for navigational items inside of Bootstrap. And then, of course, we close these tags when we're done with them. And then that defines what's happening up there in the navigation component. But right now, we're very interested in coding some very plain Jane, some very oatmeal JavaScript. So that's what I want you to conquer right now, with special emphasis on getElementById. Capiche? Good to go? Give it a shot. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, one more question. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if it's possible for HTML to access JavaScript from a separate file. Or does that
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly can. And we're not going to do that inside of this class because we're working in the serverless domain, and we're going to talk more about why we're doing it this way. The short answer is we want to put all of if we want to do serverless is about 6 times faster moving over the internet than more traditional PHP and server generated. So the JavaScript we're going to write is about 6 times faster. It's more secure because there are no plain text passwords either in the page or on the server. So it survives a lot of the security auditing. We're a big security school, so we need to have those techniques. And then also, it's harder to deny and crack into the S3. There aren't any well-known instances of that happening. Those are big reasons why. But those assets can be stored externally. as successfully. Normally, you would refer to those external elements within the head, and then use them as objects within your JavaScript here. We won't be doing very much of that though. So awesome question. You've obviously seen it before. You can experiment with it here. Okay.